start and suddenly has pressure to make a move. Suddenly they're not doing as well. They want to shake it up. And that's when I could see someone like Sam Presti kind of striking in that moment to get off those deals. But we know that he has to make a trade, Jason, because you know the Thunder are not paying the luxury tax this year. They will not do it. Not with a team that's not built to contend. And so these moves, I think, have become a when and not an if.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if you see Presti attach some of these newly acquired picks to a team to take on these contracts. I'm going to throw two teams at you, and I think that they would be the most likely destinations for both Russell Westbrook and Steven Adams. I'm going to go with Steven Adams first because I think it's a little less obvious. You mentioned the center market. I think Steven Adams would look great in Dallas playing next to Kristaps Porzingis. The Mavericks might have the most cap space left out of any team in the NBA. Maybe the Thunder can trade Adams' deal along with one of those first-round picks to get Adams off the books, get him to Dallas. And then Westbrook, I mean, where else could he end up besides the Heat? I think a locker room with Westbrook and Jimmy Butler would be just reality TV gold. They would need to put a camera in there at all times. So I ultimately think Adams could go to a team like the Mavericks, and then Westbrook, I mean, other than the Heat, where else could he end up? You know, maybe Minnesota, but I don't know if you want to go to a smaller market than OKC. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, though, this summer.
I mean, I think there's a really, really high chance that they both end up in Miami. And the reason why I could see that is that the Heat have a bunch of expiring deals. They have guys like Kelly Olynyk who don't necessarily factor in. I could see a trade where they give up, I'm just going to try and think off the top of my head. I would say, they're going to probably give up Dragic, Olynyk, Leonard, maybe James Johnson. Maybe they throw in Bam Adebayo. If the Thunder get, this is where I think you're going to see what kind of they can extract. Because I think Presti will try to get one young asset and maybe get the protections removed off the pick that they got in 2023 and make that unprotected. So, the deal that kind of makes sense to me is like maybe you get Dragic, Johnson, Olynyk, Leonard going back, and maybe you remove the protections off the pick. I think the Heat are going to try and at least keep one of those things. It'll be interesting to see how much Presti pushes, to see if he pushes to get both a young asset and that protections off that pick, or if he'll settle for one. But I could see that deal going down either way. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the deal ends up being just Westbrook and Adams for Dragic, Johnson, Olynyk, and Leonard, with the pick protections getting lifted. But knowing Sam Presti, he's going to probably push. He's going to try and do that deal and really try to get as much as he can. And if we've seen something with the Heat, they have not done a great job pushing back. So don't be surprised if they end up giving up an asset like Adebayo in the trade, Jason. Despite what you said, I agree with you. I think the value of those contracts makes them almost net negatives in terms of a trade. But I wouldn't be shocked if they end up turning them into something just because the Heat seem to be really desperate to contend. And I think that also brings up the question of what that would look like. It feels like it's almost a fait accompli that Westbrook goes to the Heat. I mean, do you think he fits if he goes there with a guy like Jimmy Butler, two guys who are ball dominant, not great shooters?
I don't think it would go well at all because their personalities are too strong to complement each other. At least like when Westbrook, in his heyday with the Thunder, had a quieter running mate in Durant, and obviously that relationship kind of fizzled out on the court. But he was the quieter type. James Harden was quiet when he was in Oklahoma City. And then Paul George is kind of like, let Russ take his shots and then found a way to play with him. When you look at a guy like Jimmy Butler and how now it hasn't worked out for three different organizations, the Bulls, the Timberwolves, and now the 76ers. So, he went to Miami to kind of have his own team. You're bringing a guy like Russell Westbrook, and that's going to be butting heads pretty much all the time. So it would make the Heat a bona fide Eastern Conference playoff team, no doubt about it. But I think it would not end pretty for the organization or either one of these players.
And you know what? I think that's going to lead me to my Heat check of the week, Jason, because I think that with this move, what we're going to see is that for all of the hoopla about this exciting, deep Western Conference playoff race, that it's not going to be quite as exciting as we think. I think we're going to get a lot of chalk next season. I think the one team that's going to be kind of potentially on the precipice will be the Spurs. But I think we've got 7 playoff spots all but locked up, Jason. You've got the Warriors, you've got the Nuggets, you've got the Blazers, you've got the Rockets, you've got the Jazz, you've got the Clippers, and the team we're about to talk about, the Lakers. I think the Spurs are pretty close to a lock as well, to be honest. I would be.
I don't know. I have New Orleans
surprised.
as a playoff team, man. And what about the Kings? I mean, they paid for everybody. So, I mean, I think it's an 11-team race for 8 playoff spots. I think you have the Grizzlies, the Suns, the Thunder, and maybe either the Mavericks or Timberwolves, kind of out of it. But I think the Pelicans are going to be real competitive, and it could be an 11-team race for 8 spots. So I don't think the Western Conference is, as top-heavy as you're alluding to right now, but you're absolutely right, because there are 3 or 4 teams that are just completely out of it, and then a couple of swing teams, because you don't know how San Antonio is going to look next year.
Yeah.
You don't know, the Rockets could end up imploding and trading a lot of their good players midseason. So, it'll be very interesting to watch this race in the West. It's only July, and we're talking about the 2020 playoff race. I mean, that goes to show how competitive the West is going to be.
Absolutely. And for me, I actually think the East might be more interesting, especially because I do think that the Heat are going to make that trade. And we're going to get to some teams here, but I think there are some teams in the East that are going to be a little worse than they were a year ago. I feel like there's some fool's gold that I'm going to talk about when we get to the signings, but there's a couple teams in the East I feel like maybe weren't quite as good as they seemed, and may have some regression to the mean next year. And meanwhile, I think there's a couple teams that might move up a little bit in the standings, but ultimately I think my hot take, if you will, is that the East might be a little bit more competitive for that 8th spot than the West is, because I think Dejounte Murray for the Spurs is going to be a stud. They talked him up last year. I think he's a great fit on the team. I said to you, I wouldn't be surprised if he's like an 8 and 5 or 6 type guy for them, along with some really superb defense. And if he can do that, that's going to make them a lot better. So I think that it's going to be chalk ultimately. But one of the teams we mentioned here, Jason, and the other team, I guess, that I would be a little concerned about missing the playoffs, Jason, are the Lakers, who they are my 0 of the week, Jason, because this was the worst case scenario for them, what happened with Kawhi Leonard. They had to do it. They had to wait. But by waiting, Jason, they give up the chance to sign really anyone else of real value. They get a bunch of role players, and it becomes the LeBron and AD show, Jason. I mean, it really is. I mean, Kuzma's fine. He's a good player, but he's not an all-star. And unless they get a lot out of one of the guys that they picked up, it's going to be tough. And those pickups are quite a list, Jason. They get DeMarcus Cousins, JaVale McGee. They get Caldwell Pope, bring him back, Avery Bradley, Quinn Cook, Alex Caruso, Rajon Rondo, Jared Dudley, and Troy Daniels. Do any of these guys light your world on fire, Jason?
Well, this was the thing, we had talked about the Kawhi Leonard sweepstakes last week, and with or without Kawhi Leonard, because the Lakers made the decision to wait this long, there was always a question of how in the hell were they going to fill out the rest of their roster. And another name on that list who will likely start for them is Danny Green. So I think that Rob Pelinka did an okay job bringing in what was left of the free agent market to surround LeBron James and Anthony Davis. I mean, out of this list, I think Danny Green's a great signing because the Lakers had no shooting last year. I think Avery Bradley, who was one of the last to sign on this list for 2 years for almost $10 million. I think it's $9.7 million. I think that's good because he can still play defense. I don't understand why they signed both JaVale McGee and DeMarcus Cousins when the league's going small and Anthony Davis might see some minutes at the 5, even though he wants to be a power forward. Why did they sign both McGee and Cousins? Makes no sense to me. I said earlier in the show that I thought Cousins would have been a better fit on the Clippers than the Lakers, but he reunites with Rondo and Davis, his former teammates with the Pelicans. Caldwell Pope doesn't move the needle for me anymore. Jared Dudley and Troy Daniels probably not going to play much. I do like the Quinn Cook signing for them because if Rondo fizzles out or gets hurt, I think Quinn Cook showed enough in the NBA Finals that he's capable of being a serviceable rotation NBA player. But this roster does not excite me. I think Magic Johnson a couple of days ago put out a tweet that said the fourth quarter lineup of LeBron, Kuzma, Davis, Green, and Bradley would be impossible to play against. And I'm like, yeah, Magic, I don't really know. I enjoy your tweets, but I know. I just, like, we said it all along, Ben. We've been saying it for weeks. The Lakers are going to have a very difficult time filling out their roster, and they could be championship favorites. I mean, Vegas has them as favorites, but they could also be a middle-of-the-pack playoff team that loses in the first round. And I think for both LeBron and Davis, that would be extremely demoralizing for them.
Here's the Magic question, Jason. LeBron and Davis last year combined to play 111 games. I think they need to play at least 120, somewhere in the 120 to 130 range for them to make the playoffs. I think if they miss more than 40 or so games combined, as they did last season, I mean, I understand a lot of that was rest. I don't think this is a playoff team. And the second thing for me is this team is going to be surprisingly reliant on getting something out of DeMarcus Cousins. Because when you really look across this roster, Jason, there's just not many offensive players who can really do much of anything effectively on offense outside of Cousins besides James and Davis. I mean, Kuzma is fine. Again, fine player. Not saying he's bad, not saying he's terrible, not saying I wouldn't want him on my team or anything like that. But he's just not an overly efficient player. He shot 45% from the field, 30% from three. Those aren't great numbers. Not really known as a defensive ace. Not sure any of these guys really have a chance to be even borderline all-stars. If they don't get anything from Cousins, Jason, I think this team could struggle to make the playoffs. And that's why I say I think they're my zero because of the risk here. And the fact that really, if we're being honest, Jason, you don't want LeBron James playing much more than 60 games. You don't want Davis playing much more than 60 games because those guys are, on the one hand, injury prone in the case of Davis, who has missed 15 games or so in most of the seasons in his career. He's only had 2 games where he played 75 or more, and he played 75 on the dot in both of those years. I mean, this is a guy who you really don't want to be playing more than 60, 70 games. And meanwhile, LeBron is going to be, I mean, he's going to be 35 years old this season, Jason. He's going to end up in the top 3 in minutes played of all players in the history of the league. If you're playing him 82 games, it's borderline malpractice in what you're doing. I mean, you're putting yourself in a terrible position come playoff time. But the question is going to be for the Lakers, can you afford not to play them, Jason? And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Can they afford to give the rest to those 2 players that they need, or are they going to end up having to drill them into the ground?
I mean, I think it's going to be somewhere in between because I don't think Frank Vogel is the type of coach to run his players into the ground. You know, they have a very polarizing coaching staff now. Jason Kidd's there. I think that's going to play a role in how many minutes that both Davis and LeBron do end up playing. But ultimately, I don't think this roster is good enough to win a championship. So I'm going to throw 2 names at you that I think could end up bumping some of these lesser guys from the roster, and that's Andre Iguodala and Kyle Korver. 2 guys that were traded in the last week and will likely be bought out, free to sign with anyone. Iggy probably wants to chase more rings, and Kyle Korver is a friend and former teammate of LeBron. So it'll be very interesting to see how they fill in the very end of the roster, because there was originally talk about Carmelo Anthony going there, or maybe J.R. Smith, who surprisingly the Cavaliers have yet to move. But I think they're going to go one notch up and get at least one of Korver or Iggy, which would make me feel better about the prospects of the Lakers. But either way, the basketball rivalry in Los Angeles is on and popping, because I think Clippers versus Lakers, we're going to see it on Christmas, and we get to see it 3 more times, likely in prime time. It is going to be very exciting. Kawhi and Paul George against LeBron and AD. Who you got?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that makes it really interesting is that the one team in the league who there's really, I guess you could say two. I mean, I think you got to put